The for sale sign has been sitting in front of the First Baptist Church of Millerville, Kansas, for 18 months now, its white paint peeling in the harsh prairie wind. What was once the economic heartbeat of this town of 847 residents now stands empty, its Gothic windows staring blindly at a main street where half the storefronts display dusty, closed signs. But here's what the real estate listing doesn't mention. When this church finally closes its doors for good, it won't just be losing a place of worship. Millerville will lose its largest employer, its primary community gathering space, its food bank, its after-school program, and the anchor tenant that kept the local diner, hardware store, and gas station financially viable. The pastor's salary alone represented $45,000 in annual local spending. The church secretary's part-time wages put another $15,000 into the community economy. The weekly grocery purchases for church dinners and events totaled nearly $8,000 per year at Miller's Market across the street. The heating, cooling, and maintenance contracts supported 3 local businesses. The Sunday attendance of 120 people meant an extra $500 weekly for the diner next door, as families grabbed lunch after service. Now multiply this scenario by 8,000, the approximate number of rural churches that have closed permanently in the last decade. Each closure represents not just the end of a religious congregation, but the removal of what economists call an anchor institution, a stable, locally rooted organization that generates consistent economic activity and provides essential community services that keep small towns viable. The economic impact is staggering, but it's largely invisible to anyone who doesn't track the intricate web of financial relationships that bind rural communities together. When journalists report on rural church closures, they focus on the spiritual and cultural losses. When economists study rural decline, they examine agriculture, manufacturing, and population trends. But almost no one has systematically analyzed what happens to local economies when churches, often the largest non-governmental organizations in small towns, simply vanish. The story begins to unfold in ways that defy simple rural decline narratives when you follow the money. Take Harmony, Iowa, population 294, where the closing of St. Mary's Catholic Church in 2019 triggered an economic cascade that transformed the entire community within 2 years. St. Mary's wasn't just Harmony's largest church. It was the town's third largest employer and one of its most reliable sources of outside revenue. The church brought in approximately $180,000 annually from the diocesan budget, member contributions that originated outside the community, and special collections that supported local charitable programs. When St. Mary's consolidated with a parish 30 miles away, that revenue stream disappeared overnight. But the real economic devastation came from the secondary effects that nobody anticipated. The church had employed a full-time custodian, a part-time secretary, and a grounds maintenance service. It contracted with local businesses for heating oil, electrical work, roofing repairs, and snow removal. It purchased supplies from the hardware store, groceries from the local market, and printing services from the copy shop. Its annual fall festival brought 800 visitors to town, generating thousands of dollars for local businesses in a single weekend. More significantly, the church building served as the community's primary venue for events that attracted outside visitors: wedding receptions, funeral luncheons, graduation parties, and anniversary celebrations. These events brought extended families to Harmony from surrounding cities, generating hotel stays, restaurant meals, and retail purchases that represented a crucial source of external revenue for local businesses. When St. Mary's closed, this entire economic ecosystem collapsed. The hardware store lost 15% of its annual revenue. The local market saw grocery sales drop by nearly $20,000 per year. The gas station's convenience store revenue fell as Sunday church traffic disappeared. But most devastatingly, the community lost its primary venue for hosting events that brought outside money into the local economy. Within 18 months, 3 businesses had closed permanently. The remaining establishments operated with reduced hours and employment. Property values declined not just because of reduced demand, but because the infrastructure that supported community events and gatherings had disappeared. The economic multiplier effect that economists use to measure how money circulates through local economies had been fundamentally disrupted. The pattern repeats across rural America with mathematical precision, but each story contains unique elements that reveal the complexity of church-based economics. In Woodland, North Carolina, the closure of 3 churches within 5 years eliminated the town's entire nonprofit sector, since all major charitable and community service organizations had been church-based. The food pantry, senior meal program, youth recreation league, and emergency assistance fund all disappeared simultaneously. The economic impact extended far beyond the immediate loss of church-related spending. Local government found itself under pressure to provide services that churches had previously delivered at no cost to taxpayers. The town council faced budget crises as it tried to replace food assistance, senior services, and youth programs that had been funded entirely through religious congregations. The volunteer labor that churches had coordinated for community projects, cleaning public spaces, maintaining the cemetery, organizing festivals that attracted tourists, simply evaporated. Woodland had to hire paid staff or contract with outside agencies for services that had been provided free through church volunteer networks. Hello there, economics enthusiasts and rural America watchers. Welcome back to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into the hidden forces that shape American communities in ways most people never consider. Before we dive deeper into this fascinating economic story, I'm really curious about our audience today. Where are you watching from right now? Are you perhaps in one of these small rural towns I'm describing, or are you viewing this from a big city where these dynamics might seem like they're happening on another planet? And here's something that might help us understand different perspectives on this issue. What do you do for work? Are you maybe an economist studying regional development? A small business owner dealing with these changes firsthand? A local government official trying to manage declining tax revenues? Or simply someone who grew up in a small town and recognizes these patterns? Your professional background probably influences how you're processing these economic relationships. The most surprising discoveries come from examining churches as what economists call regional retail anchors, institutions that generate consistent consumer traffic that supports surrounding businesses. The phenomenon is well understood in urban commercial development, where successful shopping centers depend on anchor stores that attract customers who then patronize smaller shops. But in rural areas, churches often serve this same function without anyone recognizing it. Consider the economic geography of Riverside, Minnesota, before and after the closure of its 2 largest churches in 2020. Every Sunday morning, approximately 400 people drove to Riverside from surrounding townships for church services. These weren't residents making routine trips. They were visitors bringing outside money into the local economy. The pattern was remarkably consistent. Families would arrive early and purchase coffee and pastries at the local bakery. After service, many would eat lunch at one of Riverside's 3 restaurants. Afternoon church activities kept people in town for several hours, during which they might grocery shop, fill their gas tanks, or browse the antique shops that catered to Sunday tourists. Local business owners had unconsciously structured their operations around this weekly influx of church-related traffic. The bakery opened early on Sundays and prepared extra inventory. Restaurants offered special Sunday menus an extended hour. Retail shops stayed open on Sunday afternoons when they might otherwise be closed. When both churches closed due to declining membership and financial pressures, this entire economic pattern disappeared. The 400 weekly visitors stopped coming. Sunday morning became the quietest time in a town that had previously experienced its busiest retail activity on that day. The bakery, which had generated 30% of its weekly revenue on Sundays, was forced to eliminate Sunday hours and lay off part-time workers. 2 of the 3 restaurants reduced their Sunday operating hours, and one stopped serving Sunday lunch entirely. The antique shops that had depended on Sunday browsers struggled to maintain viability with significantly reduced foot traffic. Most dramatically, the gas station that had positioned itself as the primary stop for church visitors experienced a 25% decline in Sunday sales. Since gasoline margins are razor-thin, the station had depended on convenient store sales to churchgoers to maintain profitability. Without that traffic, the station reduced hours and eventually sold to a regional chain that operated with lower overhead but provided fewer local jobs. The economic analysis becomes even more complex when examining churches as providers of what economists call public goods, services that benefit entire communities regardless of who pays for them. Rural churches often function as informal social safety nets, providing emergency assistance, disaster relief, and community services that would otherwise require government funding or simply wouldn't exist. In Harvey County, Nebraska, 5 churches collectively operated programs that provided an estimated $150,000 annually in services that would otherwise fall to local government. A food pantry serving 200 families monthly, a clothes closet for low-income residents, an after-school program for 50 children, a senior meal delivery service, and an emergency assistance fund for families facing utility shutoffs or medical emergencies. When 3 of these churches closed between 2018 and 2020, the remaining 2 congregations couldn't absorb the service load. The county found itself facing pressure to provide replacement services at taxpayer expense, but the rural tax base couldn't support the necessary funding. The result was a significant reduction in the social safety net, precisely when the local economy was struggling and more families needed assistance. The volunteer coordination that churches provided represented another hidden economic value that became apparent only after it disappeared. Churches had organized volunteer responses to natural disasters, coordinated neighborhood assistance for elderly residents, and mobilized community labor for public projects. When church infrastructure collapsed, this volunteer capacity vanished, forcing the county to hire contractors for services that had previously been provided free. The real estate impacts reveals another dimension of church closure economics that extends far beyond the religious buildings themselves. Churches often own significant property portfolios that include not just sanctuaries but educational buildings, recreational facilities, parking areas, and sometimes residential properties for clergy. When Grace Lutheran Church in Bolton, Wisconsin closed in 2021, it put 4 separate properties on the market simultaneously: the main church building, a fellowship hall, a parsonage, and a 10-acre recreational area that had been used for community events. The sudden appearance of this much property on a small-town real estate market had immediate effects on property values throughout the community. The church properties were difficult to sell because they were designed for specialized uses that had limited alternative applications. The main sanctuary building sat empty for 2 years before selling at a significant loss for conversion to a community center that required extensive renovations. The fellowship hall was purchased by a local family for use as an event venue, but at a price well below its assessed value. More significantly, the flood of church-owned property onto the market occurred precisely when demand for rural real estate was declining due to population loss. The oversupply of available properties drove down values for all residential and commercial real estate in the community. Homeowners found themselves with reduced equity, making it more difficult to relocate or invest in property improvements. The recreational facilities that churches had maintained for community use often represented the only public gathering spaces in small towns. When these disappeared, communities lost venues for social events, meetings, and celebrations that had supported local businesses through catering, decorating, and event planning services. The employment effects extend beyond direct church jobs to include a network of contractors and service providers who depended on religious institutions for significant portions of their revenue. Rural churches collectively represent a substantial market for specialized services: organ tuning, stained glass repair, bell maintenance, specialized cleaning, landscaping designed for cemetery care, and heating systems designed for large spaces used intermittently. When churches close, these specialized service providers often lose 20–30% of their customer base within a short period. Since many of these are small, locally owned businesses that serve multi-county regions, the impact can be severe enough to force closure or consolidation that reduces competition and increases costs for remaining churches. The insurance industry provides a particularly clear example of these ripple effects. Rural insurance agents often built their client base around church accounts that included not just property insurance, but also liability coverage for events, vehicle insurance for church-owned transportation, and sometimes group health insurance for employees. Church insurance accounts were particularly valuable because they represented stable, long-term relationships with organizations that rarely shopped around for coverage. When multiple churches in a region closed suddenly, local insurance agents faced significant revenue losses that forced some to close their own offices and others to merge with larger regional firms. The banking sector reveals similar patterns of economic disruption. Rural churches were typically stable, long-term customers for local banks, maintaining operating accounts, savings accounts for building funds, and often carrying mortgages for property improvements. Churches also served as informal referral sources for bank services, as congregation members often followed pastoral recommendations for financial institutions. When churches disappeared, banks lost not just the direct accounts, but also the community connections that had generated referrals for home mortgages, business loans, and personal banking services. Several rural bank executives reported that church closures had noticeably reduced their ability to attract new customers in small towns where personal relationships and community connections were crucial for business development. The funeral industry experienced particularly significant impacts from rural church closures, since churches had traditionally served as primary venues for memorial services and provided coordination for post-funeral meals and gatherings. When churches closed, families often moved services to funeral homes or had to travel to larger cities for church-based services. Local funeral directors reported that the loss of church venues forced them to invest in expanded facilities to accommodate larger gatherings, but the reduced frequency of local services made it difficult to justify the additional overhead. Some funeral homes closed or consolidated, reducing competition and potentially increasing costs for rural families during difficult times. The seasonal businesses that depended on church-related tourism discovered the economic impact of closures during traditional times of peak activity. Churches had been major drivers of rural tourism during Christmas and Easter seasons, when extended families traveled to attend services in home communities and often stayed for several days, generating revenue for hotels, restaurants, and retail businesses. The Valentine's Day weekend church services, Easter sunrise services, Christmas Eve candlelight services, and annual homecoming celebrations brought hundreds of visitors to small towns during predictable time periods when businesses could plan special promotions and extended hours to capture tourism revenue. When these events disappeared with church closures, seasonal businesses lost reliable revenue peaks that had helped them survive slower periods throughout the year. Several rural bed and breakfast operations reported significant revenue declines as church-related family gatherings became less frequent and moved to larger cities with more comprehensive religious facilities. The agricultural sector experienced indirect effects from church closures that were subtle but economically significant. Churches had served as informal networks for sharing information about farming practices, marketing opportunities, and cooperative purchasing arrangements. Rural pastors often facilitated connections between farmers that led to beneficial business relationships. Church-sponsored agricultural fairs, equipment swaps, and farmer appreciation dinners had provided venues for agricultural business networking that supported local farm equipment dealers, feed suppliers, and agricultural service providers. When these church-organized events disappeared, agricultural businesses lost marketing opportunities and networking venues that had been crucial for reaching rural customers. The veterinary services that had used church bulletin boards and pastor recommendations to reach rural customers found their marketing reach reduced when church communication networks disappeared. Since rural veterinary practices depend on word-of-mouth referrals and community networks to attract clients, the loss of church-based communication systems had measurable impacts on their ability to maintain customer bases. The construction and maintenance sector reveals perhaps the clearest evidence of hidden economic relationships between churches and rural business ecosystems. Rural churches required specialized contractors for roofing, heating system maintenance, electrical work, plumbing, and groundskeeping that operated on different schedules and requirements than residential or commercial properties. Church properties needed contractors who could work around worship schedules, handle specialized equipment like pipe organs and bell systems, and manage large spaces that were used intensively but intermittently. These requirements created niche markets that supported rural contractors who might not otherwise have sufficient work to maintain viable businesses. When multiple churches closed within short time periods, contractors lost steady, predictable income streams that had helped them maintain operations during slower residential and commercial construction periods. Several rural contractors reported that church closures had forced them to reduce their service areas, lay off employees, or exit the market entirely. The snow removal, lawn care, and seasonal maintenance that churches contracted locally provided crucial winter income for landscaping businesses that typically experienced significant seasonal revenue fluctuations. Church contracts offered steady payments during months when residential and commercial landscaping work was minimal. The technology sector discovered unexpected impacts from rural church closures as well. Churches had been early adopters of sound systems, lighting equipment, and more recently, live streaming technology that created markets for rural electronics and computer service providers. Rural technology businesses had built recurring revenue streams around maintaining church sound systems, repairing musical equipment, and recently supporting online broadcasting for religious services. Church customers were typically willing to pay for professional installation and maintenance services that supported local technology businesses in areas where residential customers often tried to handle such work themselves. When churches closed, rural technology businesses lost clients who had provided steady, predictable revenue and had often served as references for attracting other commercial and institutional customers in small communities where reputation and relationships were crucial for business development. The childcare and education sector experienced disruptions that extended far beyond the religious programming that churches provided directly. Many rural churches operated preschools, after-school programs, and summer day camps that served working families regardless of religious affiliation. These programs typically charged fees below market rates because they were subsidized by church budgets and volunteer labor. When churches closed, rural families often faced significant increases in childcare costs if alternative providers existed, or had to travel greater distances to access programs in larger communities. The impact on rural workforce development was substantial, since affordable local childcare enabled parents to maintain employment in local businesses rather than commuting to urban areas or leaving the workforce entirely. Several rural businesses reported difficulty retaining employees after local churches that had provided childcare services closed permanently. The telecommunications infrastructure that served rural churches often represented the most advanced communication systems in small communities. Churches had invested in high-capacity internet connections, professional-grade sound systems, and recently broadcasting equipment that had pushed rural telecommunications providers to improve their service offerings. When churches closed, rural telecommunications companies lost customers who had demanded and paid for premium services that had justified infrastructure investments in areas where population density typically didn't support advanced telecommunications options. The effects on rural internet infrastructure were particularly significant, since churches had often been among the first customers willing to pay for high-speed connections that made broader rural internet development economically viable for service providers. Looking toward the future, the economic implications of continued rural church closures suggest challenges that extend far beyond the religious and cultural losses that typically receive public attention. Rural communities are losing anchor institutions that provided economic stability, community services, and social infrastructure that had developed over generations. The replacement of church-based economic activity and community services through government programs or private alternatives would require public investment and institutional development that rural tax bases typically cannot support. The result may be further acceleration of rural population decline as communities lose the social and economic infrastructure that made small-town life viable. But the story also reveals opportunities for creative adaptation and institution building that could preserve some of the economic functions that churches had served while acknowledging changed demographic and cultural circumstances. Some communities have successfully converted former church properties into community centers, event venues, and social service hubs that maintain some of the economic and social benefits that churches had provided. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of the most hidden but significant economic trends reshaping rural America. The numbers tell a story of profound economic disruption that goes far beyond religious decline. We're watching the unraveling of economic and social systems that took generations to build. I'd love to hear your perspective on this. Have you witnessed these economic impacts in your own community? Do you see potential solutions that could preserve the economic benefits of community anchor institutions, even as religious participation changes? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Professor Archive for more explorations into the economic forces that shape American communities in ways that rarely make the headlines. Until next time, keep investigating the hidden connections that make our communities work.